Hi, everyone. Welcome. We'll get started in just a minute. We'll kind of let people trickle in. Welcome. I'm going to share my screen. Terrific. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to this month's Understanding ADHD Speaker Series event, hosted by the ADHD Empowerment Meetup community and the nonprofit Children and Adults with ADHD, or CHAD for short, of San Fernando Valley, Los Angeles. I'm Suzanne Sophos, our executive director, and I'm also an adult with ADHD and mom to a fourth grader with ADHD. CHAD has been hosting this speaker series for the last 6 years, bringing experts on the topic of ADHD directly to the community. This event is just a part of our work to educate, support, and advocate for adults and children living with ADHD. We also host online peer support groups for adults with ADHD, young women with ADHD, and parents of ADHD children. All of our groups are facilitated by our dedicated volunteers, and all of our work is funded by donations. Our mission is to ensure that everyone who needs ADHD education and support can receive it, regardless of finances. So there's never a fee to attend our events. However, we are a nonprofit organization and our survival depends upon donations and membership fees. So we kindly ask that if you're able and you find our work worthwhile, you consider making a $5 or $10 donation tonight to help support our work. And we'll have one of our volunteers post the link in the chat. I know we're all experts on Zoom by now, since we've all been using it so much since the pandemic, but I'd like to share a few meeting guidelines and Zoom recommendations to help you get the most out of the meeting. For your own privacy, you can set your first name and location. You can leave your last name off. You can keep yourself muted when you're not speaking. And tonight we have so many wonderful people that have joined us that we're going to keep everyone on mute. So we ask that you heavily use the chat feature throughout the meeting. You can chat with each other and connect. You can ask questions. You can tell us where you're from in the chat. We'd love to see that. If it's your first meeting, we'd love to see that too. We are going to have a Q&A portion of the meeting at the end. And so feel free to type your questions throughout the meeting, and I'll be taking note of those so that we can share those with Dr. Liz after her presentation. And we'll take as many as time permits. And Dr. Liz has been so gracious to say that if we don't get to all of them, if you'd like to submit them through Meetup, or you can email, we'll share our email address too. She will make a video and answer your questions. So we like to start all of our meetings with just a brief evidence-based overview of what ADHD is and how it impacts individuals, just so we're all on the same page before we get started. ADHD is a lifelong neurobiological condition that impacts brain function in a way that impairs executive function, delays social emotional development, and impairs our self-regulation. So rather than thinking of individuals with ADHD as simply having too much energy or too little energy, instead, a hallmark of ADHD is impaired self-regulation. So really trouble finding a happy medium with our energy and our effort. Our challenge is getting our bodies and our minds into the right frame for the task at hand. So sometimes individuals with ADHD may have too much energy, more than the situation calls for. Sometimes this is known as a hyperactive state. Maybe we get too focused on a project and forget to walk away to eat or to use the bathroom. Maybe we get excited about a new idea and talk to a friend without realizing we didn't let them speak, or maybe we interrupt when someone else is speaking. I'm guilty of that myself. Then there are times when our bodies and our minds regulate with less energy or attention than the situation calls for. And this is an inattentive state. Maybe we zone out while taking a test or having a conversation with someone on a topic that doesn't really interest us. This can also show up as trouble getting started in the mornings or getting motivated and organized to do something challenging with multiple steps, like paying bills or cleaning the house. Individuals with ADHD can veer toward hyperactive or inattentive or be a mix of the two. Again, for people with ADHD, getting our bodies and our minds to cooperate and serve up just the right amount of attention and focus for the task at hand can be extremely challenging. Studies show that if ADHD is not diagnosed and well treated, ADHD challenges can significantly decrease life expectancy by up to 13 years. This is based on the longitudinal studies done by Dr. Russell Barkley. And at the bottom, for more information, there's also a link, because I know people oftentimes have questions about those studies. But the upside to those studies is that the same ones also show that life expectancy and outcomes are dramatically improved by two things: a proper diagnosis and a lifelong holistic treatment plan. And what we mean by holistic treatment plan is a plan that encompasses different aspects of treatment. So ADHD education, skills training, medical treatment, and also peer support. Now, this slide has a lot of information, so you can also find it in our meetup group. I'm not going to go over all of the information on it, but understanding ADHD also means understanding the brain's executive functions, because those are both delayed and impaired in individuals with ADHD. These are the functions that help us do things. So they help individuals manage and regulate our planning, decision-making, learning, judgment, emotions, and actions. So basically, if we're doing something, we're using executive function. There are several models for executive function. The one we're showing here is from Dr. Thomas Brown. He's one of the most well-known ADHD specialists. And you can see here that there are multiple executive functions, things like activation, focus, effort, emotions, memory, and action. And they all work together at different times and in different combinations, depending on what we're trying to accomplish. You can think of executive function skills as a muscle that can be strengthened and developed. Executive function coaching, skills building practice, along with other ADHD treatments, can be a really strong way to support the executive function challenges that ADHD brings. I'm so pleased tonight to welcome Dr. Liz Engoff. Dr. Liz is a licensed educational psychologist with a diploma in school neurophysiology, neuropsychology, providing assessment and consultation services to children and their families. She began her career as a family advocate and educator before transitioning to become a school psychologist, specializing in response to intervention, crisis response, and helping teachers implement collaborative, proactive solutions in the classroom, which I love. If anyone else has had the good fortune to read Dr. Ross Green, he's amazing, and his work is really wonderful. Dr. Liz opened a private practice in 2014, focusing on assessments and parent support. She's also the author of the most wonderful books, the Brain Building books, which are tools for engaging children and understanding their learning and developmental differences as part of the assessment process. How we explain and talk to our children about their ADHD just truly has the potential to deeply impact their self-identity. So tonight, Dr. Liz will explain how, as parents and caregivers, we have the opportunity to use language and terms that educate and empower our children versus confusing them or shaming them. We'll also talk about how parents can support their children to find their own words to explain their diagnosis to others when and if they choose to share that information. After our main presentation, we'll have a moderated Q&A, so feel free to submit your questions in the chat at any point during the presentation, and we'll get to them at the end. And with that, I would like to thank and welcome Dr. Liz for being here. I'm going to stop my screen share so that she can screen share. And again, we're so glad to have you here, Dr. Liz. Welcome.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really, really excited. Let's hope this works. Here we go. Awesome. All right. Suzanne, can you just give me a heads up? A thumbs up if you can see what you're supposed to be seeing. Awesome. And I see more people coming in, so I'm assuming you've got a handle on that entrance door. So thank you. I'm super excited to talk to you all today about explaining ADHD to your child. But before we get into like how we actually do that, it's worth stepping back and asking the question, should we even be doing this? These are young children. We're talking about kids who are just starting to really develop their sense of self. And how do we know that it's the right time, that they're going to even understand what we're saying? And is it going to hurt their self-esteem and that sense of identity that we're trying so hard to create? And then when I talk to parents, I hear so often, what if I mess it up? What if I say something wrong? And all of this comes together to make it kind of a pretty scary proposition to start talking to kids about ADHD. So it begs the question, why are we doing this? And so about 10 years ago, I transitioned from working from the school district where, to be honest, we don't talk to kids. There's just not time for it, to private practice where parents started to ask me to talk to their kids about the same thing that I had just explained to them. And this made complete sense. I was actually really excited to talk to kids about their diagnosis, but I was really surprised to realize that I had no training in this whatsoever. Training to talk to school teams, absolutely. Training to talk to parents, of course, but nothing on how to talk to kids themselves. And so I dug around, I found some metaphors. Sometimes those metaphors worked and sometimes they didn't, because every kid is just a little bit different. I talked to colleagues who it turned out were in the same boat that I was, just kind of trying to pull at straws. We're just waiting all together till kids were older. And so I didn't have a lot, but I gave it my best shot. And my best shot was not awesome at first. I saw a lot of kids with glazed over eyes, just getting overwhelmed. One kid ran out of my office crying, which obviously is not ideal. And so I thought, maybe people are right. We shouldn't be talking to young kids. And maybe it's just too early. But I started working with more and more adults in my private practice, and adults would come in and they had some kind of history of a learning difference or difficulties in school, maybe diagnosed, maybe not. And I would ask them, okay, tell me a little bit about your schooling. What happened with your history? And they would say things like, I don't really know. I just hated school. I was kind of a dumb kid. I got in trouble all the time. My teachers hated me. Just all these just like really heartbreaking stories from their childhood. And then we go into the assessment and I would just watch the pieces kind of click. And there would be this moment where the person in front of me, this adult would say, oh my God, I had no idea that I processed the world so differently. It wasn't my fault. I'm just wired differently. I process things differently. I was misunderstood. And there's this moment of relief. And then that anger and frustration that if only I had known. And I saw this over and over again. How many years did this person lose just thinking that they were less than? And it turns out that the research is saying the same thing now that we have so many more adults who are being diagnosed later in life, that these stories are coming up over and over again. And so it became really obvious that this conversation is actually not optional. Because while talking to kids about their diagnosis can be scary, not talking to them is actually scarier. Kids know something is awry. They know that something is different, and they start to develop their own narrative about what's going on because they don't know why things are hard. So they're coming up with reasons. And this narrative that they create is rarely ever helpful or positive. And so when we start talking to kids about their differences early, and when we revisit this conversation often, we help them shift their self-narrative from something along the lines of I'm broken to I'm built differently. And that different wiring may make things difficult sometimes, but it's pretty awesome too. And so today we're going to talk about the pieces that go into shifting that narrative for our young children. And we'll talk about when kids are ready. How do we know that it's the right time to have this conversation? How to start the conversation, how to even introduce that this is what we're talking about, what to say during the conversation, and then what are the other resources out there where we can get more support if we don't have all the answers, because our kids get curious and they start asking questions. And then those tricky what if questions that come up for a lot of the families that I work with. So let's start with just when is my child ready? Well, based on what we just talked about, your child is ready now. There we go. Your child's ready now. We need to start these conversations early because kids have already started to develop those narratives. So maybe the question is not so much the kind of, are they ready, but what are they ready for? And I wanna, before we kind of start in on this, I wanna make sure it's clear what our goal is. Because it's easy to kind of get in the mindset that we're here to define ADHD, but this is actually not our goal. Because ADHD is a very bizarrely or just incorrectly kind of named brain wiring based on the research that's come out since we came up with this name. Because it stands for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, but we actually know that it's not just about attention. This is actually all of the executive functioning skills that Suzanne was talking about. We're talking about differences in the development of executive function, which is a complicated array of different skills. So attention is not the right word to start talking about all the different things that go into having this different kind of brain. And then deficit, well, we know that kids who have these kinds of brains actually have the power to hyper focus. And so it's not about a deficit of attention, it's about regulation of attention. And then not all kids are hyperactive. And this kind of brain does not create disorder in every environment. In fact, in some environments, having an ADHD brain is a benefit. And a lot of successful entrepreneurs and actors and creators and business mogul, all of these different people that we see who are saying that ADHD is the reason why I was able to do this, why I was able to achieve my goals. My different brain wiring is why I was able to to do this new thing, to do this differently, to find my path. So our goal is not to define ADHD. Our goal is to help our child understand how their brain works. We know that they have a diagnosis of ADHD. Somebody else already took care of that. If your child was evaluated, a doctor, a psychologist, the school personnel, we already have that as a way of understanding how our child's brain works. And now we're going to help our child understand not just the deficits and the difficulties that are caused by having this kind of brain, but also the strengths and the amazing pieces that come. So we're stepping back and looking at this holistically. Um, and, you know, when I said at the beginning that kids would get overwhelmed, sometimes it's really tempting to share with them everything that we know. And so I wanted to share with you just kind of thinking about the layers of understanding that a child may go through, because this conversation we're going to have with our child throughout their lifetime. ADHD is with us throughout our entire lives, and it changes what it means for us through different developmental stages. So there's no one conversation we're going to have with our child that's going to help them understand everything they need to know. We're revisiting this over time. So you can kind of think of these different layers. And one being just an awareness of neurodiversity. We can start here just by really, especially with very young children, introducing the idea that all brains are different in very important and awesome ways. And then we have another layer where we can actually use the term ADHD and talk to kids about what ADHD means for them. And then where we really want to get to is where a child can use that information, what they know about themselves, to be strong self-advocates. But I'm putting these things out there to let you know, as parents, that we don't have to do this all in one go. This is a conversation that will roll out over time and will change as your child grows into new stages of their life. And I really want to drive home the point that this can happen in small steps, in pieces. So we know that your child is ready now, but I wanted to throw out a couple just points in time that really let us know that this is a good time to sit down and say, okay, I think I want to share with you some stuff that I've learned about your brain and how it works. And one obvious one is when kids start asking, if they ask a question, and this could be any question. Why is math so hard for me? Why is Susie doing something that I can't do? Why do I have to go see this person when the rest of my class doesn't have to go do that? Those are all really good times to say, you know what, I actually have an answer to that question. Anytime you hear your child say something mean about themselves, because that tells us that this narrative, that unhelpful narrative, is really starting. When kids start getting in trouble at school, or if they don't want to go to school, that's usually a marker that they're getting some pretty difficult messages from the outside and that things are starting to get hard. Anytime your child is assessed is a really good occasion to have this conversation. And I'm going to introduce in a few minutes, actually, some language that you can use to talk about the assessment process in a way that's really going to facilitate this conversation. If they're starting a new school, or we are at the beginning of the school year, anytime they start treatment or an intervention is a great reason, because if kids know why they're getting a treatment or why they're doing something, taking medication, going to a social skills class, seeing a teacher at school, anything that learning meditation, anything that they're doing, if they know why they're doing it, it's going to be way more effective. And then, of course, after this workshop, you can turn around and tell your child that you have some cool things to share. Okay, so we know your child is ready. We know when we can get in there and really say, okay, we have a reason to have this conversation. How do you start? How do you set it up? So the place that we're going to start is with a problem that our child wants to solve. And the reason is that there might be a lot of things going on. But if we want to really help a child understand their brain, we can start with something that's meaningful to them. And we're going to use their words. If you've been through an assessment, if you've been talking to an IEP team, or just reading about ADHD, you see a lot of terms like regulation or working memory or executive functioning, but that's not how children describe their experience. So when we start, we can talk to them using words that they would say. So I want to see if we can do a little translation exercise here, because sometimes it can be really hard to translate what the psychologist has told you into words that your kid is going to understand. And we have adult ways of describing things and kid ways of describing things. And so I'm actually wondering if we can warm up the chat a little bit with this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put some of the adult ways that we describe things that we see in ADHD kids up here. And I want you to think about how your child would describe that same thing. So I'll give you an example. So we have, we talk about that children can't pay attention. Well, sometimes kids will say, I have trouble paying attention, but a lot of times they'll say, I pay attention just fine. It's just that class is so boring. And so we don't really have an attention problem to solve. We have a boring problem to solve. And then they're going to really get invested. Or they might say, these other kids are distracting me all the time. So that might be where we start. You know how you're talking about how kids are distracting you all the time. So I'm wondering if you guys can try it out. So another thing we talk about is impulsivity. So my child is impulsive. What are some ways that your child might describe the same thing that we're seeing? When we're seeing that a child is impulsive, what are some of the things that are coming up for kids that are hard? Somebody said, so many times I've heard it's boring, right? So what else? I do things and I don't even know why. It's a great one. I didn't mean to. They did this to me. I have so much energy. It wasn't my fault. Oh, these are great. Thank you, guys. I just said it without thinking. I can't help it. I get so excited. These are great. Oh, I'm just bad. Oh, that breaks my heart. But yeah, sometimes kids just feel like I'm bad and I don't know why. So some of the things that I hear are I embarrass myself or I get blamed for things, which is coming up. Another one, my child has poor executive functioning skills. What are some of the things that kids might actually say that are hard for them when we're seeing poor executive functioning skills? I forgot. Yep. I'm just not good at school. I leave everything. I lost it. Yep. Yeah. So I didn't remember, right? I have too many assignments. I can't find anything. Same thing for some of these other ones. So my child procrastinates. This is what I hear a lot from parents. And you might already be thinking this, but what I hear from kids most often when I say, it sounds like you're procrastinating, they say, no, I get it done just in time. So here's an example of something that is not a problem for a child. So we might move on to the next one. I do it later. Yep. I'm like, I do it later. It's not a problem. So when there's poor working memory, we might hear, I forget stuff. I hear a lot. There are just too many steps. I can't do long division. There are too many steps. Or we say that kids can't slow down or that they're rushing through things and they're turning around and saying it just takes too long. So when we're talking to kids, we're really going to think about how they describe things. And I can see these are awesome contributions to the chat. Thank you, everybody. My teacher is talking too fast. Yeah. So when we're thinking about how we're going to kind of introduce this conversation to kids, we want to think about what's the thing that they're saying is hard for them. And this is what the beginning of the conversation might sound like. You know how you were saying problem. You know how you were saying that your teacher's talking too fast? You know how you were saying that you keep forgetting things and that's so frustrating? I learned some things that might help us understand why that's been so tricky. Can I share with you what I learned? And this last question is actually a really important one because it lets a child know that they have some power in this discussion, that this is about them, and we're showing them that we really respect their contributions and their agency in this conversation. And 99% of the time, just by saying, "Can I have your permission to share what I learned?" they will say yes, because their curiosity is very piqued. And it takes some of that like emotional guard down. But you also know if your child says no, that they're really not ready to hear it. And you can say, all right, well, I have some things I think would be really helpful that I would love to share with you. Can we make a time to do that? Let's think about a time this weekend, maybe after dinner, we can go for a walk. Let's make a date. And that gives a child some time to prepare for like, okay, we're going to talk about something. I mentioned that going into the testing process is actually a really great time to introduce this conversation. And I actually have a specific handout available on my website. And I created a special handout page just for you guys. It's brainbuildingbook.com/Chad, where you can find all of these. And this handout has some scripts in it, just some ideas of literally things to say to help set the context for testing as an exploration process. And it takes the place of, like, hey, we're going to go find out what's wrong with you, which of course we're not telling our children, but also you're going to go play some games with Dr. Liz. It's going to be so fun. You'll get a prize. Because if we set it up as you're going to go do these fun things, then we're not engaging that curiosity of the child. And we're not focused on like, how are we going to make some things that are important to you easier for you? How are we going to help you with those things that are coming up? So when we set this up as a discovery process and get them curious and honing on a problem that they want to solve, now they're invested in testing as a way to discover something about their brain. So when we turn around on the other side and say, hey, guess what we discovered about your brain? They're already with us. We don't have to switch gears from that cool lady who gave me candy because I did so well to we learned something about you. We're going in with the child. And we're modeling some curiosity and showing that it's not just about them. We're trying to figure out how we're going to change, not only build your skills, but change the environment so it's a better fit for the way that your brain works. So these are just some examples of some of the scripts that I have in this little handout. I've noticed you've been really working hard at that problem that we just identified, but it still seems pretty tough and I'm not sure why. So I've been thinking if we knew more about how you learn best, your teachers and I could do a better job teaching you. And there's some other ones just to really engage that curiosity. Because when we do that, we start to get the kids' questions. And so paying attention to the kids' questions is another way to really get their language. So this is Alex, and Alex, I love Alex because in the middle of his evaluation, he told me, I don't have ADHD. By the way, Dr. Liz, I just want you to know I don't have ADHD. That's not me. I know people with ADHD. It's no way, no how. I was like, oh, well, that's very interesting. I don't know how we're going to have this conversation, but I paid attention to his questions and we wrote them down. This is a page from one of the books that Suzanne mentioned where we kind of document all the questions kids have and what we're discovering. But he was moving around my office and I asked him if he was having trouble finding the place he wanted to be. He's like, no, I just like moving around, but I get in trouble for it. Why do I move around a lot? And then I think somebody brought this up in the chat about like, why am I breaking the rules? Or I didn't mean to do that. He was like, I know what the rules are, but sometimes I just forget to follow them and I don't know why. He says, I have very spontaneous behavior and Dr. Liz, you think I'm super funny, but not everybody understands my jokes. And not everybody thinks I'm as funny as you do. And so these are all aspects of, not necessarily reading the room or paying attention to all those cues, very spontaneous. He's doing things before he really thinks about them. He knows the rules, but he can't seem to always follow them. And that's frustrating to him. So we can come back to these questions. And now we have our definition of ADHD. This is what ADHD means for him. And we can add in some of the strengths that we find, and now we have a complete profile in a way that he is going to really understand and get behind, even though he swears, "I don't have ADHD." So just a couple more tips for talking to kids: keeping it short, being honest about your feelings, validating theirs, making a date so it's not a surprise. I love talking. One of the things I say a lot is talk over ice cream. What I mean by this is giving kids a really sure cue that they're not in trouble when you're having a conversation like this, because it's really hard to think it's going to be bad when I'm just handed a bowl of ice cream. And these conversations can feel, because they're a big deal. They're a big deal for us as adults. So it can kind of have that feeling. But if we're, whatever talk over ice cream means in your family, going for a walk, playing, throwing the ball back and forth, going on a drive, or some other treat that really tells your child, we're just here to have a conversation. And then, as I said, using their words. All right. So now what do you say? So you know how to introduce the conversation, but what are we saying? What I found really helpful is to use a construction metaphor when I'm talking to kids. It's very accessible and everybody's been stuck in traffic. So it's a really easy to riff on and build off of. And I have kind of 4 parts. And the first is talking about our strengths or our highways, the construction zones, the things that we're building, personalizing that ADHD definition by combining the highways and construction zones, and then talking about the tools and construction crew. And these are the things that your either the accommodations your child might have, the people who might be working with them, the people who are helping them to build their brain, or the tools that they're using to really optimize their brain. These are some images from the brain building books that kind of help to illustrate the point. But I start by telling kids that their brain works by sending messages from one part to another using special neurons, or special cells called neurons. And these build all of these pathways like billions of tiny roads. And I have some plush neurons, if you can see my face, that are really fun to use to illustrate this. But when the connections really work, there are things your brain makes easy for you to do. So we can think of these as your brain's highways. And the ADHD brains have so many highways. And so we can think of creativity, storytelling, vocabulary, whatever it is that your child really shines at. And these are going to be different for every kid, because even if all of your kids have an ADHD diagnosis, their brains are all a little bit different. So I'm actually wondering if we can collectively come up with a giant list of ADHD highways, because my guess is that your kids have a lot in common. And so to do this, we're gonna do something called a chat storm. And so what I'm gonna ask you to do is take a second for yourself to write down a couple things that come easily to your child or skills they've built over time. And in a second, I'm gonna ask you to enter it into the chat, but don't press enter. So type it into the chat, but don't press enter. And I'm gonna ask everybody to press enter at the same time. So take a couple seconds to think. And then type 1 or 2 of those highways into the chat, but don't press enter yet. Okay, 3, 2, 1, go. Yes, creativity, hyperfocus, building train tracks, personality, charisma. Oh my God, those came so fast. Math, basketball, problem solver, retrieving information. These are awesome. I don't know why I don't know if you see a big red X right there. I don't know what that is, but we'll roll with it. All right. The ones that I see in a lot of ADHD brains are, they are passionate, they're enthusiastic, They are creative. They have that hyper-focus ability, generous, quick, entrepreneurial, a ton of new ideas, funny storytellers. Oh, I see more coming in. Art, that curiosity, empathy is a big one. I had a kid tell me that all his friends who have brains like his are always there in an emergency. So these are great. Awesome. Okay. So we can do the same thing with construction zones. Let's see. Sorry. Oops. Pause for a second. Oh, got rid of it. Awesome. Okay, great. So we have our construction zones as well. And these are also really common, obviously, for ADHD brains. This is how we diagnose the ADHD brain, is by these common construction zones. Some of the ones that, that are really common are writing things down, focusing on boring things, turning on your attention. And there's a lot more. When I make this list with kids, though, it's important to say that this list always needs to be shorter than the highways list, even though there might be a lot going on for our kids, and that tends to be the focus, especially when we're in evaluation mode. We're focusing on the things that are most relevant for them. So let's just take a second again to write down a couple that might be relevant for your child, these construction zones. But when you do this, I want you to write down for yourself how your child would describe those daily struggles, or what do they say is hard, or what do they complain about? So instead of working memory, thinking about like, I keep forgetting things, or I feel like I have too many assignments, what would they say? And let's do that chat storm again. So go ahead and load in your your child's construction zone into the chat, but don't press enter yet. And make sure it's as much as you can in their own words. And we'll all press enter together in 3, 2, 1, go. Enter. Yes. All right. These are great. Teacher goes too fast. It takes too long to wait. It's too many days. I do it later. I forgot because it's been a long time. Remembering math facts, that comes up so often. Everybody picks on me. Yeah, it's boring. I feel misunderstood. A lot of these things are really, really common. And actually, when we're talking about the things that are hard, knowing that other people have had the same experiences is so important. Because now we get to do the fun part where we let our child know that they are not alone. Because remember, our goal when we're doing this, we get to know that they're not alone. And so what we're going to do now is actually combine these construction zones, the highways and the construction zones, to create a personalized definition of ADHD for our child. Because our goal is not to define ADHD as it is in the DSM, or as the kind of the research defines it. We're helping our child understand how their brain works. And that's these highways and construction zones. So what that sounds like is this. It turns out you're not alone. There are lots of brains with similar highways and construction zones, and we call it ADHD. So for you, ADHD means your brain is built in a way that makes your highways come easily and your construction zones more difficult. And now that we know, our job is to maximize those amazing highways and help you with your construction projects. And that's what all those different tools in your construction crew is about. So if your child's receiving services, this is part of how we're going to maximize those highways and help with the construction projects. So what does that look like? So here is a child-friendly diagnosis for River. So she is in elementary school, and the definition we came up with for her, because what she complained about was writing. She just did not like writing one bit. And we found that her brain is super quick to come up with new ideas and super creative, but it may be hard for your hand to keep up with those ideas when you're writing. So now we've found a way to connect those highways with something that she's working on that's really helping her understand, oh, okay. And this is not weird or something no one's seen before. It's actually really, really common, and there's a name for it. And then our friend Alex, this is where we landed with his definition. So ADHD means your brain is built in a way that makes creativity, hyper-focus, curiosity, and your awesome ideas come super easily. But turning on your attention for boring things and waiting your turn to share, which was definitely something he was frustrated about, much more difficult. So there are lots of ways to do this, and I'll come back to this. Actually, I'll read through a couple of these. So ADHD means your brain is built in a way that makes memory and creativity easy, but writing and waiting your turn more difficult. Or your brain is noticing a lot of things at once, but it may be tricky to focus in on the one thing that your teacher is asking. It means your brain enjoys things that are new and exciting, but it may be harder to learn things you have to repeat a lot, like math facts, right? We can put these things together so that it makes sense for the child and it's really relevant. So now we get to practice this for your child. You just wrote down some of your child's highways, and you wrote down some of those construction zones in their words. And we can bring those together. And there may be ones that work together, kind of like these examples that I showed you. Or it may be something that just makes it really relevant, that like, these are your strengths and this is the thing that we're gonna work on. And when you're trying this out for yourself, think about putting in 1 or 2 highways in just one construction zone, just to make it really simple. What are the most relevant things? So I'm going to give you a minute just to kind of think that through and see if you can come up with one for your own child. And as you do, if you are willing to share, I would love to see some examples in the chat, so that we can share those as a community and people can see other examples of ones that you're coming up with. If it's hard to come up with one on your own, I'm going to leave this slide up here, because if one of these is really close to your child, this might be one that you can use one of these as a starting point and change a word or two, or even just throw one of these in the chat if this one like really resonates for you, for your child, kind of what might be relevant to your child. Okay, awesome. For you, ADHD means you're extremely curious and have lots of great questions. But it may be harder to wait to ask all your questions to the teacher or wait for other students to ask theirs. ADHD means you can remember all the details in SpongeBob, but have a hard time remembering how to solve math problems. I think that's an amazing way to describe those differences, right? They can feel so frustrating and be frustrating to teachers too. Why do you remember all this, but you can't remember this thing? It's part of how this works. ADHD makes it fun and easy to come up with a project to build, but it's not so easy to do things other people ask you to do. Oh, that's so important around motivation and kind of how to turn on that focus to get through a project. Your ideas and rules come easy, but following others' ideas and rules may be more difficult. And understanding how big ideas and events connect comes easily, but waiting until it's your turn to talk or choose the conversation topic is more difficult. These are amazing. And we're going to be able to capture all of these so that everybody can benefit from this kind of collective contribution. So thank you, everybody. All right. So there are a ton of resources out there, sometimes an overwhelming number of resources, but if sometimes that after kind of giving that personalized definition, it's often really helpful to show kids that they are not alone by showing them that there are other people out there talking about ADHD. And so my favorites are the How to ADHD YouTube channel, if you're familiar with that. These ADHD comics by Danny Donovan that I'll show you. Just Googling famous ADHDers. And actually, if you go on the chad.org website and search there, they have a great article with some great folks. And then I have a bunch of resources as well on my website. So I'll show you these. This is Jessica McCabe, who a lot of you, I think, know. This is my favorite video to show kids after they get an ADHD diagnosis, because she talks about her 10 favorite things about having ADHD. And I'm just going to show you a minute or two of this because I want you to hear how she talks about how frustrating, just validating how frustrating it can be, and then goes into the reasons why she would not give up her brain for the world. And knowing that ADHD brains are all different, your child is likely to connect with some of these. They might not connect with all of them, but it is so fun to watch this with parents and kids together because they're like, oh, that's me. Oh, that's totally you. Do you remember the time you did this? That's you. So here we go.
Hello, brains. I've always loved having ADHD. My favorite aunt had it too, so when I was diagnosed as a kid, it was like getting to join this cool club. But after a year of research, I've discovered it's responsible for a lot of challenges that I didn't realize. I still love my ADHD brain, but some days when I'm sleep deprived, when my symptoms are worse than usual, and I'm buried under piles of research talking about the potential negative consequences of having ADHD, I have to wonder, would I rather not have it? It's easy to fall into that kind of thinking when you're focused more on what you've done wrong than what you've done right. But as somebody told me recently, ADHD is not a failed version of normal. Our brains just work differently, and with those differences come a lot of strengths. So yeah, even on my worst days, I'm glad I have ADHD. And here's why. Here are my 10 favorite things about being a brain. Number 10, we are enthusiastic. Does this mean we might talk over you some? Absolutely. But it also means we give the biggest hugs, get excited about the smallest successes, and you'll never have to worry about awkward silence. Number 9, we're willing to take risks. Yes, this can mean we burn ourselves with steamers sometimes, but it also means we jump headfirst into challenges and opportunities when others would rather play it safe. According to my research, ADHDers are 300% more likely to take the risk of starting their own business, and sometimes those risks pay off. Number 8, we're resilient. Failing a million times means coming out stronger. Things not going according to plan is just another day at the office. So when everybody else is freaking out, we are working on solutions. Number 7, we are funny. Failing a million times also means developing a sense of humor. You can't walk into walls, pull your keys out of the freezer, or show up 15 minutes late to work on your day off, again, without learning to laugh about it. That sense of humor not only helps us get through our challenges, but makes life fun for everyone else around us. Number 6, hello brains.
Oops.
Getting to...
There we go. So yes, I don't have time to watch the whole thing today, but I highly recommend you go back and watch it. You will see your child in there. And it's just a really, really well done video. And if you don't know about her channel, definitely explore all of the different pieces there. Whatever question my ADHD kids come up with, there's always an answer there. So it's just a great resource. The other one I want to make sure you know about is Danny Donovan's comics at ADHDDD.com/comics. She has just some incredible visuals that really capture some of the experiences of having this kind of brain. And for younger kids, I'll often go pick a couple that they might relate to. And for older kids, I just pull up the webpage or the website, and we just go through and find ones that speak to them and explore them. And it's such a powerful message of you are not alone. this is something that other people have experienced and have turned into art, have found their successes with, and there is just a huge, vibrant, awesome community for you. And this community includes all of these amazing actors and athletes and performers and entrepreneurs and everybody that you can dream of who's had an idea and just ran with it. And as I said before, you know, we talk about the benefit of this kind of brain when you are in an environment that supports you and just works for you and jives with the way that your brain works. On my website, again, you can get this at brainbuildingbook.com/Chad with all of the things that I referenced here. And I have a spreadsheet that is a living document. I'm constantly adding to it as I find new things that are really helpful for either my clients or those in the community. There's just a lot of many more links on here. And I know that ADHD often, our kids have multiple ways of describing how their brain works, which means they might come with multiple diagnoses. And this spreadsheet actually has resources for a number of different diagnoses, including autism, dyslexia, emotional challenges, different behavior regulation, and then some other random things like epilepsy. So resources for talking to kids. So finally, there's always that question of what if? And I always get this when I talk to parents, just that nagging feeling of what if I mess it up? And I want to bring you back here because I want to really reinforce the point that there is no messing this up. It may be more of a question of what if it's harder than I thought? And what if I get thrown a curveball? And our kids are full of surprises. They may ask a question we're not prepared for. Something else might come up. We might be surprised by our own emotional reaction. If you also have a similar kind of brain to your child and life was not easy for you, it's going to be emotional. So it can be challenging, and that is okay. We're in it for the long journey and really helping them develop that narrative across their lifespan. And so you can always stop and try again later. You can take really small steps, and asking for help for another caregiver, family member, a teacher, a babysitter is actually really helpful because kids hear things differently from different people. And so getting everybody involved on the same page with the same language is going to be really helpful for your child really developing that understanding of your brain, of their brain. You can acknowledge that you're learning too, because we all are. And just remembering that this is a journey of 1,000 miles. So we take that first step. It's going to be a single step, and there will be many stumbles along the way as our kids figure themselves out, as we are learning about our children, and they're constantly changing and growing and evolving. And so I hope that this workshop has brought you a number of resources that will be helpful on your journey. If you have any challenges, you can also call me. I am always on your team and always happy to talk to families. And I have some other resources that are coming out. I am working on a book that is actually more of a workbook to really help parents feel prepared. And this language, all this examples of language that we've been talking about, and those vibrant, engaging visuals are part of this. The Parent's Guide to Explaining ADHD is going to be a workbook style tool that really will walk you through these exercises that we did today, along with a lot of other information that will really help guide your conversation wherever you are in your child's development. And it comes with the brain building books as well. So for the younger children or the older children, and these visuals really help with kind of driving home the point and help you document your conversations, so you can revisit it along the way and you have that living kind of piece to help your child understand themselves as they get older, and even watch some of those construction zones turn into highways as they get older. So thank you guys for, by the way, if you're signed up for this workshop, or if you go on my website, please make sure you're on my mailing list to stay tuned for when the parent guide does become available, if this has been helpful for you. And so I should be sending out something within the next couple weeks. So thank you everybody for being here. Here's my contact information. These are the tools and handouts, where the tools and handouts are available, brainbuildingbook.com/chat. And I am happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Liz. That was wonderful. We do have a few questions here that I'm going to try to kind of consolidate because a couple of them are very similar. So one of the big ones that we've heard from a couple different people is children that have multiple diagnoses. So like maybe they have ADHD and dyslexia, or they're twice exceptional, and how this approach might differ for children that either knowingly, maybe they get a full assessment and so they get all those diagnoses at once, but sometimes we know they're layered on top. You know, maybe you first get an ADHD diagnosis and then a couple years later there's a dyslexia diagnosis, or even an autism diagnosis. So how would that impact the process that you've explained to us tonight?
Yeah, I think it's a really, really good question, and it can get tricky. However, what I found to be really helpful is when thinking about what's most important to the child, what they're talking about that's getting in their way, or what problem they want to solve, it can really direct us to the most important piece of that diagnostic picture. Professionals love to diagnose every single thing, and a lot of kids end up with 5 or 6 diagnoses. And so often when I'm talking to the child, or when I talk to the parents about like, what are we going to tell the child, we kind of pick the thing that is really going to most capture what the child's working on right now, and what's most going to answer the child's questions that they're asking. Often, if a child has multiple learning disabilities and ADHD, but the thing that is like really on their mind is, I keep getting in trouble, and like I'm having trouble making friends. We might talk to them about the ADHD piece and how that affects learning. But I might not name also dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia. I'm not going to name all those things, but I might say, one of the ways we can think about your brain is this ADHD brain, and it's really common, and this is what it means. And it does show up in learning. And right now it's making reading really hard. Because even though we have these categories, our brains don't work like that. They're actually, the way that your brain is wired happens to show up on a number of different checklists, but they're all overlapping and related. Most kids with ADHD wiring struggle with writing in some way. It's like, it's a really huge overlap. And I would wager that a lot of folks get ADHD and dysgraphia together. Do we have to explain to the child each one of those diagnoses? No, we can talk about ADHD and then how it shows up right now in different parts of this child's life. And then when things are layered on top of each other over time, we can talk to kids about how, now it looks like we have some new information that actually helps us understand you even better. And is that going to add to the child's ability to understand their brain? Is there a new problem that came up that this new information is really going to help? For ADHD and dyslexia, there are so many people that show up on the ADHD, like celebrities with ADHD, that are also on Made by Dyslexia. So looking for those people who overlap is another way. Like Richard Branson is on every website.
And look at him.
It's just sometimes there are people you can find that actually do show up in multiple places. So that's a little easier to connect with. But I think thinking about the problem the child wants to solve, and how do we best help them understand what's going on, and the interventions that are really going to help drive that.
Great, thank you. Another question that came up was, a lot of times our children, because of the consequences of some of the behaviors associated with ADHD, they have from a very early age a negative self-narrative, thinking that there's something wrong with me, or why do I do this? And so as parents, are there some ways that we can balance the need for almost like the increased amount of discipline or correcting that needs to be done kind of surrounding our children and what they go through, so that we don't impede on, creating that negative self-talk or making it worse?
I would highly recommend, I'm a big supporter of Ross Greene's work, and you mentioned as well. Mona Delahook is another person who is just really talking about some of the behaviors that we see as symptoms of the problems that our children are trying to solve. Every behavior that you see is a child's attempt to solve a problem. If we figure out what that problem is, we can help them solve it in a way that's not punitive. You did something wrong, right? We're going to say, oh, okay, now I understand what the problem was. Of course you walked out of class, right? Let's go solve that problem, and now you won't have to walk out of class. Or I can see how just how dysregulating, how overwhelming that was for you. Of course your body had a reaction. Let's go solve the dysregulating part, and then you won't have to have that reaction. And I think that there are a lot of people who take that more relational approach to behavior, but seeing behavior as a symptom rather than we're going to train a child to replace that behavior with something else. We're going to go Ross Greene uses upstream to figure out what was the problem.
The real problem.
Real problem. And I think there's a ton of, I have talked for hours on Ross Greene. Mona Delahook also is in that camp, and often somebody that parents look to as another person to really help get those lenses on in a way that is really helpful to children. So when you see that behavior and they need correcting and kind of redirection, that the way that we do that is by trying to work with them to figure out what's the problem that led to that, and not shaming the behavior.
That's such a
so
good answer.
the books, Ross Greene, it's The Explosive Child is, or livesinthebalance.org is his. And then Mona Delahook, Beyond Behaviors is her book.
That's great. Yulia shared those in the chat, and I appreciate that answer so much, because that I'm so passionate about his work as well, because it's helped my family tremendously from a very early age with my son. So it definitely works, and those are great resources that you've shared. Another question is, so can this be modified, or how would you recommend using this to explain to siblings and other family members about a child's ADHD?
The workbooks are actually awesome tools for that, and a lot of families will actually the child will take their workbook home and read it to their sibling, share it with their sibling, and either younger or older. It works both ways, and it just makes it a very bonding activity, and takes it off of the child and more into this other kind of physical thing. And so having that tool is really helpful. You know, talking to siblings in the same way as like we learn some, like we notice that you get frustrated sometimes when your sibling does this, or you've been curious about, you've been asking questions about this. And, you know, it turns out we found out some pretty cool stuff about your sibling's brain, and we thought it might be helpful to share it with you. Is that okay? And having that same kind of conversation, and starting with, well, you know, your sibling went through all of this stuff at school, or you might know we were taking them to all those doctor's appointments, and we learned that they have all these highways and strengths, and we learned that they're working on some things. That metaphor, construction zones, is just like very helpful to kids to now see their sibling as, oh, they're working on something. They don't have that skill yet. This is like all the growth mindset goodness that we like really try and and get into our kids' brains, that we're using that same language with our siblings as well, so that when they complain about their siblings and be like it's so frustrating that they don't have that skill yet, is really different than so-and-so is, you know, doing something bad. And so same language, just, you know, shifting. The only other thing I would add to that is that I think it's really important to talk to the child first before talking to their siblings. Is it okay to share this with your sibling? I think it would be helpful. Or do you want to sit with it for a little while longer before we share? Or what do you want to share? That power and agency, and this is my diagnosis, or this is my piece of information, is just very important to getting to that advocacy piece. Because your child will understand themselves in a way that's different than whatever we're seeing, and we're helping them build that vocabulary now. So any place that you can give them some agency is just really helpful for everybody, but encouraging nonetheless to say, I think it would be really helpful if your sibling understood what's going on, so they can, you know, so it can make your relationship better.
That's great. You know, speaking about the idea of agency, sometimes our children have to, or wind up having their ADHD disclosed to teachers and things like that because they have IEPs. And so this is kind of twofold questions that we got. One about how can we guide our child about sharing their diagnosis with other people, because sometimes they have to disclose before they're ready. And then I'll save the next one. It was, but I'll go ahead and tell you in case it like flows in with the answer, is about how we can help our children explain their ADHD to their friends when they're ready.
Mm-hmm. Oh, it's such a good one. So a lot of times after we've kind of gone through this process, I'll ask a child to say, okay, so now if your teacher, you know, if someone were to ask you like, oh, ADHD, what does that mean? What would you say? Because sometimes kids will just read what I wrote down, but sometimes they'll come up with something like totally different. And it's really interesting to hear like what they've been processing, because our, you know, like just the nature of the wiring is that there's like constantly kind of new information coming in, and they're reassessing, and they might be, you know, 5 steps down the road before I've finished writing down what we just said, right? And so it's really interesting to hear what they say. And then I will give them a ton of props for that and say, you know, I think it would be really helpful for your teacher to know that. And, you know, is it okay if I share it? And often that can be really helpful because they know exactly what is being shared. Another way that I've approached it is, you know, so we're going to meet with the school, and it's actually really important that they know about the ADHD diagnosis, because this is how we're going to be able to help you get what you need for reading, for writing, you know, those audiobooks that just make everything so much better. This is how we get you those. You know how, like, when you have a computer, just it changes everything. This is how we get you a computer instead of having to handwrite things. This is how we solve your problem. So this is by sharing this. And so this is like part of the process. Is there anything that we've talked about that you don't want me to share? And so now I've kind of recognized, like, I can't get you help unless we share this, but I still want to make sure you have some agency. The other question I'll ask is, do you have any concerns about me sharing? For the most part, younger kids, they might have concerns, but they still know that parents are in control. Teenagers sometimes have told me I don't want to. And then the next step is just figuring out why. Like, okay, let's press pause. You can always call your IEP meeting and like your IEP team and say, I need to delay the meeting a week because my child's still processing and I really want them to be on board. That is totally okay. Logistically, I know it gets complicated, but it is totally okay that you have that power as a parent to say, we're not ready yet. And to give your child a little bit of time, because I just can't say enough how important it is for kids to really feel empowered and to have agency, and that they're part of this conversation. And we're including them in trying to problem solve. If they say no, I want to know why. What are you worried about? What part of this is concerning to you? Because I know you want things to get better. So there must be something getting in the way. And it's that same Ross Green approach, like, what's getting in the way here? We got to discover it. But when we do that, we're really going to understand more about what's getting in the child's way, and they are going to feel so much better about what goes to the school or what goes to whoever it is.
That's great. That kind of brings me to the next question, is that we had two people that were asking, might you change the approach any if the child is older? Specifically, one child, they were talking about having trouble accepting that he needs help with his executive functions, and he's an older child. And then another child who's 11, and their parents are concerned about putting labels on him and how that might impact him. And so are there different things that we need to consider when we're engaging teenagers in this process versus younger kids who can sometimes be a little bit more willing to go with the flow?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think with teens really getting at their questions, it becomes even more important. And what are the things that are challenging for them, and how do they describe it? Because what I was saying, that whole translation piece, it's kind of, there's a different reason for it. For younger kids, it's so they understand. For older kids, it's a lot so that they feel heard and they understand, right? I mean, I guess don't quote me on all of that, because it's all true for all kids along the spectrum. But when I think about my teenagers, my first thought is, how do I help this kid feel heard? Because a lot of times, if this is the first time they're hearing about it, then they have probably been going through some things that have been hard. They've come up with their own narratives. And so really thinking about how we can give them space to express what's been going on in their words without being corrected. Like, everybody's on my case all the time. Well, that's because you're always doing things at the last minute. We can step it back. Everybody's on my case all the time. All right, everybody's on your case all the time. Tell me more about that. And that validation is so important. And if we can get to those pieces, like, I think I figured out why it feels like I'm on your case all the time, because I am always afraid you're not going to get things in on time. And what I learned is that your brain is actually wired in a way that it works better under pressure than in planning. And my brain works when it has a lot of planning time. And so I think we're having this conflict because I keep telling you to work like my brain does, and it's not how your brain works. Is such a different way of presenting it than like, hey, you got to realize that this is because there's something broken with your brain, which I know is not what anybody is saying. But I think shifting that lens to like, oh, this is a different way of processing. What's the child's perspective on all of this? And can we get in there using their language to start the conversation about what's going on. And you may be taking baby steps. It may be you may be a while before we say, and we call this ADHD.
Yeah.
Or now we're going to drop back to, that's why everybody keeps saying ADHD.
Yeah.
Put that to the side for a while and just say, like, your brain works differently. We got to figure this out, or else we're going to be fighting till the end of time. So let's figure that out.
Do you have any advice for a parent who maybe has been aware that their child has executive function challenges and may even have ADHD, but hasn't had this conversation with them yet? One of the questions we had is from someone who I believe, if I'm understanding correctly, they haven't disclosed it to their child yet. And so the child is a bit older, and how might they open the door to this process with a child in that case?
Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of reasons why parents might be concerned about using the term ADHD. And so starting the conversation using that, like all of the same language that we use, but subbing in the term neurodiversity or terms like executive function, which is something that all teenagers are working on and building. Actually subbing in these terms for older kids who can, process this vocabulary. It turns out like now that you're a teen, I've done this a lot actually. Now that you're a teenager or getting to be a teenager, it turns out your brain is actually working on some pretty important things. And they're called executive function. They're called working memory. Dan Siegel has a great video. It's one of those animated things. It's about the pruning process of the adolescent brain. And so it's another tool for just normalizing that executive functioning, emotional regulation, all of these things are part of being a teenager. And so introducing just your brain is building things. There's also this term neurodiversity. And so we can talk about, all brains are different and wired differently. And it turns out that like this way of doing things doesn't work for you. Remember this teacher that was just like a bad fit? It turns out that teacher didn't teach to the way that your brain works, but this teacher really does. And thank goodness we're in this class this year, or the reverse. I think that your teacher is not teaching to the way that your brain works. And we can still use sophisticated terms like neurodiversity and to ease our way into the conversation and get a sense of where our child is at. And then to say, it turns out that the way your brain is wired actually has a name for it. And it's common. There are a lot of people out there that share this kind of wiring. And if there are people that your child can connect with, it's a really great way to introduce it, like this other athlete like you, like this other like entrepreneur like you. And to take it one step at a time and just describing, getting really comfortable talking about all these differences and the construction projects that your child's brain is going through. And there's a ton of terms that are equally applicable, even if there are reasons why you're not feeling ready for ADHD yet. And then there are a lot of, roping in other family members or a professional who's on your child's team to actually talk about a diagnosis can be really helpful in those cases if there are things that are making you feel like, I don't know if this is going to go well, because it is very emotional. And so it can be really tricky.
And in cases, I should have mentioned too that this particular child has experienced some trauma. And so might there be additional considerations for disclosing this late when there's been trauma involved in different earlier parts of their life?
Yeah. Do you mean trauma related to
No,
not being diagnosed?
I think separate trauma, and they're concerned about adding to his anxiety with the diagnosis and having this conversation. Everything surrounding that. He's quite high functioning, but their parent is concerned about the fact that there is trauma there already, underlying trauma associated probably with other things.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like there's a lot of layers. And I kind of have a two-part answer. One is that what I said before, and kind of what's one way to think of it is kind of what's driving the train, or what's the biggest piece that a child really needs to understand. And a child who's gone through trauma, that can be the biggest piece that is just really important to understand, and still talking to them about it in the same way. Like your brain is trying to protect you, is kind of the summary of that. So these reactions, they're not your fault. Your brain is really on high alert because it's trying to make sure that nothing bad happens to you. And we can start there while we're working on the trauma piece. The second piece is that when our kids are really complicated, it is, it can be really helpful to get a professional on board to help get through all those pieces, or help you even identify where's the most important piece to focus right now. And when is it time to shift over to something like looking through an ADHD lens? Because we'll cover a lot looking through the trauma lens, but it sounds like it's a very just like tricky and layered kiddo, or just like a tricky layered case. And that this kiddo has been through a lot. And so having some guidance of where to start, or what's most important right now, where is the piece we want to focus on, can be really, really helpful. And then remembering that this is the journey of 1,000 miles, right? That we're taking it one step at a time to help kids understand themselves. So what's most important about your child understanding themselves right now?
That's great advice. Thank you. Let's see, we had a question. Is there a way to help your child deal with difficult family members who don't believe in ADHD, or with negative verbiage towards the child? And I will add to that, from my own experience, is having, people that also say, oh, everybody is a little bit ADHD, or like, there's nothing different about you. Everybody has that. And those kind of things that we hear from extended family who sometimes mean well, sometimes don't. How do we help our kiddos deal with that?
Yeah. Oof. So I think the first thing that comes to mind is that you've just addressed one of the big reasons why it's so important to have these conversations with our kids, and to really help them understand how their brain works and why certain situations don't work for their brain. Because the stronger that message is in them, the easier it will be to brush off the person who's throwing shade their way. And the other piece of that is every time that you're in a situation like that, it's an opportunity to reflect with your child after, and to model how you are processing what that person said. Like, wow, that family member like really didn't get it. Or like, I was very shocked when so-and-so said that to you, because I could totally see that you meant this. Or even just like, wow, that was really hard. That seemed really hard. What was that like for you? And to give your child a chance to let them know. I think I was listening to maybe like a mindful parenting podcast at some point, and she was talking about a game where her child was on the losing team, and it was so tempting to say like, oh my God, are you okay? That seems so awful. And instead she stopped herself and she said, oh, how was that for you? And he's like, it's great. I had my first assist ever. And so her child didn't care that they lost. He got an assist, right? His experience was great. And so I think we process the world different than our children. We are constantly on the lookout for things that are harmful to our children. So we are going to definitely be noticing all of these things and then trying to figure out, okay, and then how did my child process that? If they processed it as a negative, I'm going to really get in there and flip the script for them. If they didn't process it at all, then great, awesome. Like, good. They're letting it slide off their shoulders. And we can also just say like, I noticed that like, so-and-so had a lot of negative comments, like, what was that like for you? And then you can hear them saying, like, whatever, like, I know that I didn't mean to do that. And so it's okay.
Yeah,
right?
that's such a great point. The stronger that we're able to give them their own self-identity about all of this, then those things might just slide off their shoulders. But I love the fact that you're talking about modeling. As the parent, you're modeling, and then you're also checking in with them if you need to, because I think a lot of times we tend to check in with them sometimes when we don't need to. How did you feel about this? And they're like, what? So that's the beauty sometimes of an ADHD child, is sometimes my son will, if I check in with him about something, he'll be like, what? I didn't even notice that happened. And I'm like, oh, great. Yay. That's good. So great. Thank you. Let's see, there was another question. How do you address hyper focus on video games as possibly related to ADHD, and the need to have balance and find ways to stop without withdrawal symptoms? I know that my son plays video games a lot, but he uses it to decompress. So sometimes I feel like, screens and things like that can be healthy, but when we need them to stop, is there a good way for us to have that communication with them, so that there's not, they're calling it withdrawal symptoms, but I know what they mean. It's that, we have, those of us with ADHD can often have trouble transitioning from one activity to the next, especially when it's a non-preferred activity that we're being asked to switch to.
Right. There's a great book and it's slipping my mind. But it uses all these same principles. So the big thing with technology often is trying to figure out what's the problem we're trying to solve. And it's different for different kids. For some kids, the problem is transitioning off of it. For some kids, the problem is that after I've been playing for so long, I'm completely emotionally dysregulated, right? Like I can't, it's really hard to like re-engage with other people. I've stopped, but it's really, really hard. For some kids, the like playing video games is so emotionally activating that it can be really tough, even though they like it, but it can be like very tough. And so, and there might be something else that's going on. So figuring out what the challenge is and really addressing that challenge. And so if your child really uses video games to decompress, and they're having trouble transitioning off, then the problem we want to solve with our child is, okay, how do we help you transition off? I know that me nagging you every 5 minutes is like not working. So we'll put that off the list. And then like, let's come up with solutions that may work. And so I recently, we figured out with a family that the 5-minute warning, the parents were kind of expecting that the child would wind down their activity. But the child was thinking, oh, I have 5 more minutes until it's time to wind down the activity. Yeah. So the parents were expecting that the box would be off and everything would be put away and the child would be in the kitchen in 5 minutes. And the child was like, oh, in 5 minutes, I'll like start the shutdown process. And so it's just like finding these disconnects is just really, really important in figuring out a solution, like really experimenting with different solutions to solve that problem. If it's like activation, it's like transition, like what games are going to work when and how do we decide that? It's like Wired Generation or something. I'll email it to you, but it is a great book that looks at the different levels of there's like 3 levels of intervention for video games and really seeing, and electronics in general, and seeing them as a tool of our kids' generation. So we're not knocking them, but we're helping kids to use them.
Oh, that's great. I will share that in our meetup group as well, because I think that's great. I think it's an important nuance for us to consider, because it is a different generation than most of us grew up in. And I see the benefits of it. My son wants to code video games and things like that. And, you know,
with their friends, right? Like there's just like
yeah.
so many levels of awesomeness to it.
Exactly. And I mean, one thing that I have learned, which is an aside, but I will share it because it's helped us tremendously, is that we as parents, when we're telling our children that it's time to transition, have to remember that they are involved in something that can't always be ended like that. So they might lose their progress, or so we have to, you know, be collaborative with them and understand what they're experiencing, so that when we tell them to stop, I mean, the thing that I get a lot is, okay, but can I just finish this level, or can I just finish this? And, you know, we have to be receptive to that. Otherwise it does escalate things. So,
and you can't solve it in the moment.
You can't.
There's no solving it in the moment.
No.
So it's always something that we got to backtrack and then solve it before the next video game time.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Awesome. These are great questions. I feel like I've really been using a lot of my brain to wrap my head around it.
These are great answers. The last two are I think a little bit easier, and then we will close it up. One person asked, in terms of celebrating neurodiversity, are there any children's books that you maybe know of or would recommend? And if you can't think of any off the top of your head and you want to send me some, I can put them in the meetup post later.
There are so many. So the tools spreadsheet that I showed you, that's on brainbuildingbook.com/Chad, and many other places on the website. There are a lot there that speak to, I have one section of that spreadsheet is for just general neurodiversity. So there are videos and books there. And there are also a lot that are specific to ADHD. There's a ton for autism. And so I can, why don't I send you a couple resources and you can see what's the most relevant for this group.
Terrific. And then there were a couple people asking about getting copies of the 11-year-old plus brain building book, and getting single copies, and if those were available on your website.
Soon for parents, that they will be available as a single copy with the parent guide for talking about ADHD. And so I will be emailing the group that attended this workshop with more information about that.
Great. Fantastic. Yeah. I'm so excited. I was like eagerly looking at the workbook. I will just say, I found Dr. Liz through her books, and they have been tremendously helpful in our family. So I was so excited and delighted that she was able to be here tonight to speak to everyone. Your presentation was wonderful, spot on. Thank you. And your answers to these questions were just so thoughtful. And we really appreciate the time that you spent with us tonight.
Well, thank you. It's been really fun for me too. So I hope it's helpful for everybody else out there. Thank you for coming and for joining us.
Thank you all so much. And Julia has posted in the chat our donation button. If you guys have gotten anything out of the meeting tonight and you'd be so kind as to donate $5 or $10, we greatly appreciate it. All of our meetings are free, and our support groups, which I should mention, you can find on Meetup. We have support groups for adults, support groups for young women, support groups for parents. We have a wonderful work group. I see Adam is here tonight, and he hosts our work group for adults. It's an accountability work group on Wednesdays where we all get together and talk about what we're going to be working on and check in with each other for accountability. And then we have this wonderful meeting once a month where we have speakers such as Dr. Liz come and speak to us all. So thank you all. I know you're not all members in our community, so I thank all of you that visited us tonight and came along with Dr. Liz. Thank you for taking the time to visit us, and thank you again to Dr. Liz. I'm so grateful. Thank you.
Thank you,
Good night,
guys.
everyone. Thank
Good
you.
night.